the safest building in Los Angeles was designed to protect people. Reinforced concrete walls, Class A construction, earthquake-proof from foundation to turret. And it worked. For nearly a century, not a single tremor has cracked its frame. But the dangers that found the Chateau Marmont never came from the earth. They checked in at the front desk. They arrived with luggage and entourages and pharmaceutical habits that no amount of poured concrete could absorb. Fred Horowitz built a fortress in 1929. He just never imagined that the threats would already be inside it. This is the story of a building with a split soul. One half fortress, one half trap, and the nearly 100 years of silence that held the two together until the people paid to keep that silence decided they would rather speak. Chapter 1. The attorney who fell in love with a castle. In 1925, a Los Angeles lawyer walked through the Loire Valley and saw the building he would spend the rest of his fortune trying to recreate. His name was Fred Horowitz. He was not a romantic by reputation. He had graduated from the University of Southern California's law school, built a modest practice, and made money in a city that rewarded men who understood paperwork more than poetry. Los Angeles in the mid-1920s was not a place for dreamers. It was a place for dealmakers. The population had tripled in a single decade. Orange groves were being bulldozed for subdivisions. Every hillside was a future development. Every vacant lot was an argument waiting to be settled in court. Horowitz understood this city. He profited from it. He knew the zoning codes, the permit processes, the way land changed hands in Southern California with the speed and moral complexity of a card game. But something shifted in the Loire Valley. The Chateau d'Amboise sat above the river like a stone fist, gray and enormous and older than any building Horowitz had ever touched. It had housed kings. It had witnessed conspiracies. In 1498, plotters against the French crown were hanged from its balconies and left to dangle above the water as a warning to anyone who might consider challenging power from inside its walls. The chateau was not beautiful in the way Americans understood beauty. It was not delicate or decorative. It was beautiful because it had survived everything. 5 centuries of war, revolution, neglect, and renovation, and the stone still held. Horowitz came home and could not stop thinking about it. He found a site on a hillside above Sunset Boulevard. The land sloped steeply, which made it difficult and expensive to build on, which also meant it was cheap. Below, the boulevard was already becoming the most famous road in Hollywood. Limousines carried studio executives to meetings. Billboards for pictures that had not yet been released lined the sidewalks. Above, the hills were quiet. Coyotes moved through the scrub at night. The location was perfect for what Horowitz had in mind, a residential building that looked like a castle and performed like a bank vault. He hired the architectural firm of Arnold A. Weitzman and the engineer Loy Lester Smith. The plans were ambitious and, for Los Angeles in the 1920s, borderline eccentric. 7 stories of reinforced concrete. Walls thick enough to absorb the force of any earthquake the San Andreas Fault could deliver. Class A construction, the highest rating available, a designation normally reserved for commercial buildings and government offices, in a city built almost entirely of timber, where fire swept through neighborhoods with terrifying regularity and the ground itself could not be trusted to remain still. Horowitz was building with the only material that took all of these dangers seriously. The structure rose through 1927 and 1928. 43 apartments. Gothic turrets modeled directly from photographs Horowitz had taken at Amboise. Arched windows set into concrete walls that were measured not in inches, but in feet. A steep roof that served no practical purpose in a city that received fewer than 15 inches of rain per year, but served every aesthetic purpose a man in love with a French castle could desire. The building was a fantasy rendered in the most practical material available. Concrete does not burn. Concrete does not shake apart. Concrete does not care what happens inside it. The total cost ran to approximately $1.5 million. In today's money, that figure approaches $25 million. Horowitz poured nearly everything he had into the site. He was not building a hotel. The distinction matters. He was building luxury apartments for the wealthy residents of a city that seemed to have no ceiling on its growth. The logic was airtight. Los Angeles was booming. The film industry was printing money faster than any factory in Detroit. The location was premium. The construction was unmatched. Every variable pointed in the same direction: up. On February 1st, 1929, the Chateau Marmont opened its doors. 300 guests attended the inaugural event. They drank champagne in a lobby that smelled of fresh concrete and new carpet. They admired the turrets from the garden. They signed leases. Every apartment was spoken for within weeks. Horowitz stood in the building he had willed into existence and believed, with the absolute confidence of a man who had built something earthquake-proof, that he had also built something recession-proof. He was wrong. But that reckoning was still 8 months away. For now, the building stood on its hillside, immaculate and full, a fortress that had no idea what it was about to become. Chapter 2, 8 months of perfection. Then the floor fell out. The building survived every earthquake that ever hit Los Angeles, but it could not survive October of 1929. The stock market did not crash all at once. It shuttered on October 24th, a day traders would call Black Thursday. Then it rallied, briefly, the way a wounded animal sometimes stands before it falls. The papers printed reassurances. Bankers gathered at the offices of J.P. Morgan and pledged to support prices. For a weekend, the country held its breath. On October 28th, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped nearly 13%. The next day, it dropped another 12%. In 48 hours, $14 billion in market value evaporated. Fortunes that had taken lifetimes to build dissolved between breakfast and dinner, and in the luxury apartments above Sunset Boulevard, leases began to break. Horowitz watched it happen in slow motion. The tenants who had signed 12-month agreements simply stopped paying. Some left, without notice, their apartments emptied overnight. Others renegotiated at rates that could not cover the building's mortgage. The phone calls from the bank grew more frequent and less polite. The fortress was barely a year old and already bleeding money. Reinforced concrete walls could stop an earthquake, but they could not stop a bank run. The building held. The finances did not. By the early 1930s, Horowitz was forced to sell. The buyer was Albert E. Smith, a retired film pioneer who had co-founded Vitagraph Studios in the 1890s and sold it to Warner Brothers in 1925 for a substantial fortune. Smith was in his 60s. He had already lived one full career in the motion picture industry. He understood Hollywood not as a place of glamour, but as a place of commerce, where every beautiful image had a price tag attached to it, just out of frame. He paid approximately $750,000 for the Chateau Marmont. That was half of what Horowitz had spent building it, and the loss broke something in the attorney that documents and depositions cannot fully capture. Smith had no interest in running luxury apartments in a city where the luxury market had collapsed. His solution was pragmatic and, in hindsight, transformative. He converted the 43 apartments into 63 hotel suites. He subdivided the larger units, added kitchenettes where none had existed, and created a building that could accommodate shorter stays and smaller wallets. He furnished the new suites not with new furniture, but with antiques purchased at Depression-era estate sales. He was buying the belongings of the newly ruined at pennies on the dollar, mahogany desks that had sat in mansions in Pasadena, ornate mirrors that had reflected the faces of families who no longer existed in their previous financial form, silver that had been polished by servants who had since been dismissed. The chateau filled with the beautiful debris of other people's catastrophes, and the effect was unexpectedly perfect. The rooms felt lived in. They felt old. They felt like rooms that had stories, because the furniture inside them did. The conversion worked. Not immediately, and not grandly, but it worked. The film industry, unlike almost every other sector of the American economy, did not collapse during the Depression. Attendance at movie theaters actually rose. People who could not afford to eat well could still afford a ticket to forget. The studios kept producing, the stars kept working, and the people who orbited the film industry needed places to stay that were not the grand hotels on Hollywood Boulevard, where reporters lingered in lobbies and gossip columnists kept informants on staff. Harry Cohn, the head of Columbia Pictures, is widely credited with delivering the Chateau Marmont's founding commandment. The phrasing varies depending on who tells the story, but the core message was simple. If you must get in trouble, do it at the Marmont. Cohn understood something that Horowitz, for all his engineering genius, had not anticipated. The building's greatest asset was not its earthquake resistance, it was its discretion. The thick concrete walls did not just absorb seismic force. They absorbed sound. The hillside location did not just provide views, it provided cover. The labyrinthine layout, with its multiple staircases and side entrances, did not just confuse visitors. It protected secrets. And so the first generation of guests arrived. Greta Garbo, already famous for wanting to be alone, found a building that let her be. Jean Harlow, whose private life bore almost no resemblance to her screen persona, discovered a place where the gap between the two could exist without consequence. Howard Hughes took a penthouse and stood on his balcony with binoculars, watching the young women at the pool below, a figure of enormous wealth and deepening eccentricity, perfectly suited to a building that asked no questions. The studios arranged sham marriages and secret meetings, and the chateau provided the architecture for both. None of this was planned. Horowitz had built apartments. Smith had converted them into a hotel. Neither man had set out to create Hollywood's most important hiding place. But the building did not care about intentions. It simply offered what the city needed most: walls thick enough to hold a secret. And once Hollywood discovered what those walls could do, it never let go. Chapter 3. The fortress that became a hiding place. The same reinforced concrete that stopped earthquakes also stopped sound, and Hollywood noticed. The architecture of secrecy at the Chateau Marmont was not designed. It was discovered. The building had no grand lobby where guests might be observed arriving or departing. The entrance was tucked into the hillside, almost invisible from Sunset Boulevard, reached by a narrow driveway that wound uphill through trees. The corridors inside wound through the structure at odd angles, a consequence of fitting 7 stories onto a steep slope, and the result was that 2 people could stay at the chateau for a month and never encounter each other. Staircases led to exits that opened onto different levels of the hillside. A guest could leave from the garage without passing through any public space. A visitor could enter a bungalow from the garden without ever stepping inside the main building. The place was a maze, and in Hollywood, a maze was a gift. In a city built on manufactured images, the chateau offered something no studio could provide: a place where the image could be safely removed. Actors under morality clauses, contractual provisions that allowed studios to terminate their contracts for behavior deemed scandalous, could behave as they actually wished to. Behave. Marriages of convenience, arranged by publicists to mask affairs or orientations that the public was not prepared to accept, could be suspended for an evening. The distance between a press release and a human being's actual desires could stretch as wide as it needed to, and the walls would hold. Erwin Bredauer purchased the hotel in the early 1940s and brought something the building had not previously possessed: a conscience. Bredauer desegregated the Chateau Marmont at a time when most hotels in Los Angeles flatly refused black guests. This was not a legal requirement. The Civil Rights Act was still more than 2 decades away. It was a choice made quietly by a man who looked at the racial codes of his city and decided to ignore them. Duke Ellington stayed and composed music in the hallways, his fingers moving over invisible keys as he walked from his room to the elevator. Other black musicians and performers followed. The decision was not announced. No press release was issued. As with most things at the chateau, the revolution happened in silence. While the rest of the city enforced its color lines with the blunt instrument of custom and law, the chateau simply opened its doors. The same walls that protected white celebrities from gossip columnists now protected black artists from the indignities of Jim Crow Los Angeles. The building did not distinguish between the kinds of secrets it kept. A forbidden affair and a forbidden dinner were held to the same standard: silence. During the Second World War, the chateau took on yet another role. Its reinforced concrete construction, originally meant to resist earthquakes, now qualified it as a bomb shelter. The War Department identified buildings along the Pacific coast that could withstand aerial bombardment, and the chateau, with its Class AA rating and walls measured in feet, rather than inches, was among them. Humphrey Bogart and a young Ronald Reagan were among those who gathered in the basement during air raid drills. Searchlights swept the sky above Sunset Boulevard. The turrets that Horowitz had modeled after a French castle stood against the California darkness, like something out of a medieval siege. The irony was thick enough to touch. A building modeled on a fortress where conspirators had been executed was now sheltering Americans from the possibility of Japanese attack. The fortress kept performing its original function. Only the threats kept changing. By the pool, quieter revolutions unfolded. Anthony Perkins met Tab Hunter there in the 1950s. Both men were leading men in an industry that would have destroyed their careers if their relationship became public. The production code still governed what could be shown on screen. The gossip magazines paid informants in every restaurant and hotel in Los Angeles. But the pool at the chateau, surrounded by hedges and set below the sight line of the boulevard, offered the closest thing to freedom that 2 closeted actors could find in Eisenhower's America. They swam, they talked, they existed for a few hours at a time without performance. The building asked nothing and said nothing. It simply provided the space. Consider the scale of what the chateau had become by the middle of the 20th century. 7 stories of reinforced concrete, 63 suites and bungalows spread across the main building and the garden cottages behind it, a monthly rate of approximately $750 at a time when the median American household earned roughly $2,000 per year. A Class A structural rating that no other residential building on Sunset Boulevard could match. 43 original apartments now subdivided and expanded into a complex that could hold more than 100 guests at capacity, a guest list that read like a secret history of the 20th century. And a staff trained, whether by instruction or by instinct, to see nothing, hear nothing, and repeat nothing. The Chateau Marmont had reached its peak of hidden influence. It was the place where the rules of the outside world genuinely did not apply. But rules suspended are not rules abolished. They are rules stored, accumulating interest, waiting to be collected. And the bill, when it finally came, would arrive not as an earthquake or a fire or a financial collapse, but as a body on a bed in a bungalow behind the garden. Chapter 4. The death that made the hotel famous. On March 5, 1982, a personal trainer walked into Bungalow 3 and found the most famous comedian in America dead on the bed. John Belushi had checked into the Chateau Marmont 5 days earlier. He was 33 years old. He had starred in Animal House, which had earned more than $140 million at the box office. He had been a founding cast member of Saturday Night Live during the years when the show redefined what comedy could be on American television. He was, by most measures, the biggest comedy star in the country. He was also deteriorating so visibly that people who loved him had stopped being able to watch. The bungalow cost $250 a night. It sat in the garden behind the main building, a small cottage with its own entrance, surrounded by enough foliage to ensure that whoever went in or came out would not be. Casually observed, Belushi had chosen it for exactly this reason. He was working on a screenplay with Don Novello, the comedian who played Father Guido Sarducci. The work sessions were intermittent. The drug use was not. Belushi was consuming cocaine and heroin with an intensity that alarmed even people who had spent years in an industry where alarming drug use was considered part of the professional landscape. The details of Belushi's final week at the Chateau Marmont are granular and ugly and have been reconstructed through police reports, witness testimony, and the investigative work of several journalists. On the night of March 4th, Robert De Niro visited Bungalow 3. He arrived through the garden entrance. Cocaine was sitting openly on the coffee table, not hidden, not tucked into a drawer, sitting in plain view, as though it were a bowl of fruit. De Niro stayed briefly. He left. Robin Williams arrived later, also briefly. He was in the early stages of his own career, not yet the global star he would become, but already moving through the same social circles. Neither man knew he was among the last people to see Belushi alive. The visitors came and went through the garden entrance, and the building, as always, said nothing. The woman who stayed was Kathy Evelyn Smith. She was a backup singer turned groupie turned drug supplier, a woman who occupied the specific zone of the entertainment ecosystem where access to famous people and access to controlled substances intersected. She later admitted, in an interview published in the National Enquirer, that she had injected Belushi with a mixture of cocaine and heroin known as a speedball. The injection was the last in a series that had continued through the night. At some point before dawn, while the garden outside was quiet and the main building slept, Belushi's heart stopped. His body continued to cool on the bed as the sun came up over the Hollywood Hills. Smith left the bungalow. She drove out of the parking lot the wrong way, her headlights sweeping across the garden where Belushi's body lay perhaps 100 feet away, already beyond any intervention. The wrong way exit was the kind of detail that seemed almost too symbolic to be real. A woman driving away from a death she had caused, moving in the wrong direction, while the building that had contained everything watched from its hillside and said nothing. His personal trainer, Bill Wallace, found him around noon. Wallace had been staying at the chateau as well, in a separate room, keeping an eye on Belushi in the way that people keep an eye on someone they know is in danger but cannot save. The paramedics who arrived confirmed what Wallace already knew. Belushi was dead. The cause, initially, was listed as natural causes. In a man who was 33 years old, overweight but not critically ill, the designation was absurd, but the chateau's machinery of silence was still operational. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner would eventually rule the death an accidental acute cocaine and heroin intoxication. Kathy Smith would eventually be charged with first-degree murder, a charge that was later reduced to involuntary manslaughter. She served 15 months in a California prison. The immediate aftermath followed a script the Chateau Marmont had been rehearsing for 50 years. The staff cleaned the bungalow. Management issued minimal public statements. The police investigated, but did not find a building eager to surrender its secrets. The other guests continued their stays. The pool remained open. The front desk continued to answer the phone with the same measured courtesy that had been its hallmark since the 1930s. The machinery kept running because the machinery had never stopped. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Bob Woodward, the Washington Post journalist who had broken the Watergate story a decade earlier, arrived to research a book about Belushi's death. His account, published as Wired in 1984, described the Chateau Marmont as seedy. The word landed like a slap across the face of an institution that prided itself on the opposite of seediness. The hotel's attorneys demanded a retraction. Woodward's publisher issued a clarification. The chateau was many things, but seedy was not one of them. Seedy implied neglect, decay, a place that had given up. The chateau's condition was not neglect, it was strategy. The slightly worn furniture, the dim lighting in the corridors, the absence of corporate polish and gleaming brass were all features, not flaws. They signaled a place that valued comfort over appearance and privacy over prestige. The difference between seedy and deliberately understated was the difference between a man who cannot afford a suit and a man who chooses not to wear one. The legal skirmish over Woodward's word choice resulted in an $18 million lawsuit. It also resulted in something far more valuable to the chateau than any settlement: publicity. Every newspaper story about the lawsuit mentioned Belushi. Every mention of Belushi mentioned the chateau. And every mention of the chateau reminded a certain kind of person that this was the place where the most famous comedian in America had spent his final days doing exactly as he. Pleased, observed by no one, reported by no one, stopped by no one. Guests began requesting Bungalow 3 specifically. The bungalow where a man had died became the bungalow where people wanted to sleep. The building absorbed the death the way it absorbed everything, silently, completely, without visible damage. But the absorption changed the chemistry of the place. Before Belushi, the Chateau Marmont was a discreet hotel where famous people could misbehave in private. After Belushi, it was the discreet hotel where a famous person had died and the discretion had held. The tragedy became a proof of concept. The walls had been tested with the most extreme scenario imaginable, and they had not cracked. Consider the arithmetic of this transformation. One dead celebrity, one bungalow at $250 per night, one visit from Robert De Niro, one visit from Robin Williams, one injection administered by Kathy Smith, one wrong-way exit from the parking lot. 15 months served for involuntary manslaughter, one $18 million lawsuit, one retraction from a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, 0 guests who canceled their reservations. The mathematics of infamy, it turned out, were excellent for business, and there was a man watching from the margins of the entertainment world who understood exactly what that guarantee was worth, and who intended to put a price on it. Chapter 5, The Man Who Sold Silence. André Balazs had never managed a hotel, but he understood something about secrecy that no hotelier before him had thought to monetize. He came from an unlikely background for the hospitality industry. His father was a professor at Harvard. His mother was a psychologist. The household was intellectual, analytical, comfortable. Balazs himself had attended Cornell where he studied not hotel management in the traditional sense, but something closer to the mechanics of human desire, how people make decisions about luxury, status, and belonging. What makes one space feel exclusive and another feel merely expensive? Why certain environments attract loyalty that transcends rational calculation? After graduation, he drifted into Andy Warhol's orbit, that strange incubator of artists and entrepreneurs, and people who were neither but understood both. Warhol's world operated on a specific principle. Visibility was currency. Being seen at the right place, with the right people, at the right moment, was worth more than talent, money, or effort. Balazs absorbed this lesson completely. He married Katie Ford, the heir to the Ford modeling agency, a union that placed him at the intersection of fashion, wealth, and the manufacturing of image. The Ford agency did not sell beauty. It sold the idea of beauty, packaged in human form, distributed through photographs. The business was not fundamentally different from Hollywood. Both industries created images of people that bore only a selective resemblance to the actual people behind them. Both industries required spaces where the distance between image and reality could be managed. Balazs understood this architecture of illusion better than almost anyone in New York or Los Angeles. What the truly wealthy wanted, he determined, was not luxury. Luxury was everywhere. Any developer with capital could install marble bathrooms, Egyptian cotton sheets, and lobbies that smelled of orchids and money. What the truly wealthy wanted, and what no other hotel was explicitly selling, was the feeling of being protected from the consequences of their own behavior. They wanted a space where the rules of public life, the scrutiny, the accountability, the performative virtue that fame increasingly demanded, could be suspended. They wanted, in short, what the Chateau Marmont had been providing by accident for 6 decades. Balazs purchased the hotel in 1990 for a reported $12 million. Some accounts place the figure slightly higher. The price, regardless of the exact number, was remarkable. He was buying a building that had housed Garbo, sheltered Hughes, absorbed Belushi's death, and maintained 60 years of unbroken silence. $12 million for all of that history, all of that mythology, all of that accumulated trust, was a bargain, and Balazs knew it. His renovation strategy was brilliant in its restraint. Most hotel developers, upon acquiring a property with the chateau's pedigree, would have gutted the interiors and installed contemporary finishes. They would have added a spa. They would have built a new restaurant. They would have modernized the lobby and hired a celebrity interior designer to put their stamp on every surface. Balazs did the opposite. He renovated the building to look as though it had not been renovated at all. The old furniture stayed, or was replaced with old furniture that looked like the old furniture. The slightly worn carpets were replaced with slightly worn carpets. The lighting remained dim. The lobby, such as it was, remained small and deliberately understaffed. A guest arriving for the first time might mistake the lack of polish for neglect. A guest arriving for the 10th time understood that the lack of polish was the entire point. Behind this careful aesthetic of timelessness, the actual infrastructure of secrecy was systematically upgraded. Fences grew higher around the perimeter. Landscaping grew denser along every sightline that a camera lens might exploit. Hedges around the pool thickened until the pool was invisible from every angle except directly above. The parking area was restructured so that arriving guests could move from their cars to their rooms without crossing any space visible from the street. The staff, always discreet by instinct, was now trained in discretion as a formal discipline. New employees received explicit instructions. Never acknowledge a guest by name in the presence of another guest. Never confirm or deny that any specific person is staying at the hotel. Avert your eyes in hallways. Move through spaces as though you are part of the furniture. Be present without being noticed. Exist without existing. The rates climbed. When Balazs arrived, a room at the chateau cost approximately $150 a night. Within a decade, the figure had passed $500. By the early 2000s, suites were listed at $950 a night and climbing. The bungalows, those cottages in the garden where Belushi had died, and where countless other dramas had unfolded behind closed doors and dense hedges, were significantly more. The prices were not competitive with other luxury hotels in the area. They were higher. And the rooms were not nicer. In many cases, they were deliberately less polished than what a guest could find at the Four Seasons or the Beverly Hills Hotel for the same money or less. The premium was not for the room. It was not for the view. It was not for the thread count. The premium was for the silence. Balazs understood that the chateau's client base was extraordinarily concentrated. Roughly 70% of guests were repeat visitors. The top 100 clients generated the majority of the hotel's revenue. This was not a business that depended on volume or on attracting tourists or convention attendees or business travelers with expense accounts. It was a business that depended on loyalty, and loyalty in this context meant a mutual agreement. The hotel would not reveal what the guest did, and the guest would continue. Paying for the privilege of not being revealed. It was a pact. It was a transaction, and it was, in every meaningful sense, the sale of complicity. Consider the economics of this model at its peak. 63 suites and bungalows. An average nightly rate that exceeded $800 across the property. A repeat guest rate of 70%, a top tier of perhaps 100 clients who returned again and again, spending tens of thousands of dollars per year. Lindsay Lohan's 47-day stay reportedly generated a bill of approximately $46,000. The chateau did not aggressively pursue her for the balance. It could not afford to. Pursuing a celebrity guest for an unpaid bill would require acknowledging the stay publicly, and acknowledging the stay would shatter the product. The debt was the cost of doing business. The silence was the business. The chateau under Balazs was not a hotel. It was a membership in a mythology. The dues were high. The benefits were invisible to anyone outside the membership. And the membership fee was complicity. But silence, as a product, has a flaw that no amount of reinforced concrete can fix. It requires human beings to produce it, and human beings, unlike concrete, eventually crack. Chapter 6. The silence that protected everyone except the staff. The same training that taught employees never to reveal what a celebrity did in a bungalow also taught them never to reveal what a manager did to a housekeeper. The system of silence at the Chateau Marmont was total. It did not distinguish between kinds of secrets. It did not sort the information it suppressed into categories marked acceptable and unacceptable. A housekeeper trained to ignore cocaine on a nightstand was also a housekeeper trained to ignore a hand where it should not be. A front desk clerk trained never to confirm a guest's identity was also a front desk clerk trained never to confirm a supervisor's misconduct. The same cultural imperative that made the hotel valuable to its celebrity clientele made it dangerous to its workers. The discretion was the product. The product could not be selectively applied. And the workers who produced the product were also the people most harmed by it. Reports that emerged years later in legal filings and media investigations and the testimony of people who had spent decades inside the building painted a picture of a workplace where silence was enforced in every direction. A housekeeper reported that a guest had exposed himself and begun masturbating during room cleaning. The housekeeper did what she had been trained to do with every other piece of uncomfortable information. She informed her supervisor. Nothing happened. No formal response. No follow-up. No investigation. No report filed with human resources. No communication back to the worker who had been subjected to the experience. The guest remained in his room. The housekeeper was expected to return to work the next day and clean the same room with the same silence she brought to every other task. The message was delivered not through words, but through their absence. The guest's comfort was the priority. The worker's safety was not a product the chateau sold. In 2013, the hotel's human resources director, Carol O'Brien, departed. The specific circumstances of her exit have not been fully disclosed. But her departure coincided with what employees described as the collapse of any functional internal grievance mechanism. Workers who had previously had at least a theoretical channel for complaints, a door they could knock on, a person they could speak to, now had neither the door nor the person. The HR department continued to exist on paper. On the organizational chart, it occupied its proper place. In practice, the pathway from a worker's complaint to an institutional response had been severed as cleanly as if it had been cut with a knife. Jimmy Cahew, a longtime employee who later spoke publicly about conditions inside the hotel, described practices that extended the culture of silence into the realm of racial discrimination. Black guests calling to make reservations were, according to Cahew, subjected to a form of screening by telephone. Their voices were assessed. Their names were evaluated. Those who were permitted to book were sometimes directed upon arrival to interior dining areas, away from the pool and the garden terrace, where the hotel's most visible and most photographed guests congregated. The sorting was quiet, as everything at the chateau was quiet. No signs were posted. No written policy existed that could be subpoenaed or leaked to a reporter. The discrimination operated through whispered instructions and understood norms, through the slight shake of a head, through the practiced redirect of a host who had learned to perform segregation without ever saying the word. The ban list was another instrument of selective enforcement. Approximately 260 names appeared on it. Some were banned for property damage, the broken furniture and shattered mirrors that are the predictable aftermath of certain types of celebrity behavior. Some were banned for unpaid bills that exceeded even the chateau's generous tolerance for outstanding accounts. Some were banned for behavior that disturbed other paying guests. But the application of the list was strikingly uneven. High-spending guests, those who contributed to the top 100 who generated the majority of revenue, were granted tolerances that lower-spending guests were not. A rock star who destroyed a bungalow and spent $200,000 a year might receive a gentle conversation and an invoice. A less famous guest who committed a lesser offense but spent less generously might find the door permanently closed. The list was not a set of rules. It was a set of negotiations, conducted in the currency that the chateau valued above all others: revenue. The staffing ratio told its own story: roughly 4 workers for every room, housekeepers who cleaned the suites and bungalows, maintenance staff who repaired what guests broke, kitchen workers who prepared food that was served in rooms where the remains would not be discussed, servers who delivered meals and cleared the evidence of meals, front desk personnel who answered phones and forgot what they heard, gardeners who maintained the hedges that maintained the privacy, security who watched the entrances and saw nothing worth reporting. Each one trained, formally or by osmosis, in the same discipline. Do not speak. Do not report. Do not disrupt the experience that the paying guest has purchased. The hierarchy was absolute and ancient in its logic. The guest was the client. The worker was the mechanism. The mechanism did not have feelings. The mechanism did not file complaints. The mechanism functioned, silently and continuously. Or it was replaced. By 2019, the Chateau Marmont was generating extraordinary revenue. The suites were full most nights. The bungalows were booked months in advance. The celebrity clientele continued to return with the regularity of migrating birds. The repeat rate held at its historic 70%. The mythology, built over 9 decades and polished by Balazs for 3 decades, was intact and profitable. The building stood where it had always stood, 7 stories of reinforced concrete on a hillside above Sunset Boulevard, gorgeous and impenetrable and producing silence at industrial scale. But the workforce holding that silence together had been absorbing damage for years. The housekeepers who cleaned rooms after parties that left shattered glass and white powder on every surface. The kitchen workers who endured ethnic slurs from supervisors who assumed the insults would be absorbed like every other secret. The maintenance crew who fixed what celebrities broke and billed it to accounts that were sometimes never collected. These people were the invisible machinery of the chateau's most valuable product. And machinery, when neglected long enough, does not simply slow down. It breaks. Hashtag Chapter 7. 200 and 48 people. 0 severance checks. When the pandemic shut Hollywood down in March of 2020, André Balazs made a decision that shattered 30 years of loyalty in a single afternoon. The virus moved through Los Angeles the way it moved through every major city in the world, first as rumor, then as precaution, then as emergency, then as a force that rearranged everything it touched. By mid-March, the governor had issued stay-at-home orders. Hotels emptied. Restaurants closed their doors and covered their windows. The entertainment industry, which had spent a century generating enough money to insulate itself from nearly any crisis, found itself confronting a problem that money alone could not solve. You cannot film when the actors cannot gather. You cannot host when the guests cannot travel. You cannot run a hotel when the entire concept of proximity, of being in the same room with another human being, has become a threat. Balazs laid off 248 employees, the entire operational workforce of the Chateau Marmont, from the housekeepers to the kitchen staff to the front desk, clerks to the maintenance workers. All of them, gone in a single action. No severance was offered, no transitional packages, no continuation of health benefits during a pandemic that was killing thousands of people per day, no acknowledgement, beyond the minimum required by law, that these individuals had given years, and in some cases entire professional lifetimes, to maintaining the silence that had made André Balazs wealthy. Walter Almendarez had worked at the Chateau Marmont for 26 years. He had watched the building transform under Balazs from a faded Hollywood landmark into a luxury destination that charged nearly $1,000 a night for the privilege of its discretion. He had been part of the invisible infrastructure that made the mythology possible. 26 years of arrivals and departures, of messes cleaned and secrets kept, of a life organized around the rhythms of a building that did not know his name. His severance package was $0. Martha Moran had worked at the chateau for 33 years. 33 years. She had been employed at the hotel longer than many of the building's walls had borne their current coat of paint. She had outlasted renovations, management changes, celebrity scandals, and at least one death that made international headlines. She had watched Balazs arrive as the new owner and had adapted to every new policy, every new instruction, every new layer of silence he introduced. Her severance was also $0. The workers applied for unemployment benefits, they applied for food assistance programs. They stood in the lines that formed outside government offices across Los Angeles in the spring of 2020. Lines that stretched around corners and down entire city blocks. Lines full of people who had been told a week earlier that their jobs were secure. They did what millions of Americans did. They tried to survive a catastrophe that was not their fault and that they had no power to control. But unlike most laid-off Americans, the Chateau Marmont workers had a specific grievance that went beyond the pandemic itself. The hotel received approximately $1,950,000 in Paycheck Protection Program funds from the federal government. The PPP was designed with a simple and explicit purpose: to keep workers on payroll during the shutdown. The money was supposed to flow from the government through the business to the workers whose jobs the program was created to protect. Employees alleged that the funds were not used for this purpose. The money arrived at the Chateau Marmont. The workers did not see it in their bank accounts. The gap between the program's intention and its alleged execution became another silence. Another thing that the Chateau expected everyone to maintain without discussion or complaint. Then Balazs made his second major decision of the pandemic, and it was this one that transformed a labor dispute into a war. He announced that the Chateau Marmont would convert from a hotel to a private members-only club. The conversion would fundamentally alter the nature of the business. Instead of a hotel that accepted reservations from the public, the Chateau would become an exclusive institution that admitted only paying members. The change would eliminate the need for the kind of large service staff that a traditional hotel required. It would also, not coincidentally, eliminate the workforce that was now outside the gates, angry, organizing, and increasingly willing to say things in public that they had been trained for decades to keep private. The union, Unite Here Local 11, interpreted the conversion as exactly what it appeared to be: a strategy to avoid unionization by eliminating the very jobs that would be unionized. The workers who had spent decades being trained in silence now had nothing left to lose by speaking. They had been fired without severance. They had watched federal relief money disappear into the institution they had served, and now they were being told that the institution itself was transforming into something that no longer required them, that the building they had maintained and the silence they had kept were being reorganized around their permanent absence. They marched. They carried giant novelty checks printed with the severance amounts they had not received. They stood outside the gates of the building where they had spent their careers, the building whose secrets they had kept, whose messes they had cleaned, whose mythology they had personally maintained with their labor and their silence, and they made noise. For the first time in the Chateau Marmont's history, the people responsible for its silence were making the opposite of silence, and the building, watching from its hillside as it had always watched, had no mechanism for absorbing this. Chapter 8. 30 Voices Break Through Concrete Walls. On September 16th, 2020, The Hollywood Reporter published a story that did what no earthquake had ever managed. It cracked the Chateau Marmont open. The article was built on the testimony of more than 30 former employees, most of them speaking on the record, most of them using their real names. For a building that had spent 91 years perfecting the art of silence, the sound of 30 voices speaking simultaneously was deafening. These were not anonymous sources hiding behind the shield of confidentiality. These were named human beings who had decided that the risk of speaking publicly was less than the cost of remaining quiet. That calculation, more than any single allegation in the article, told you everything you needed to know about what had happened inside the building. The allegations were specific and damning. Former workers described a culture of racial discrimination that permeated hiring practices, guest relations, and the daily operations of the hotel at every level. Black employees reported being passed over for front-of-house positions, the visible roles that interacted with guests in favor of white colleagues with less experience, and shorter tenures. The pattern was consistent enough and lasted long enough that it could not be attributed to individual bias or isolated incidents. It was institutional. It was systemic. It was policy expressed through practice rather than written documentation, which made it harder to prove in court, but no less real to the people who experienced it every working day. Latino kitchen workers described enduring ethnic slurs from supervisors over periods of years. The language was so routine that it had become part of the acoustic background of the workplace, as ordinary and unremarked upon as the clatter of dishes being stacked or the hum of the industrial ventilation system. The slurs were not whispered. They were spoken at normal volume in front of other employees by people who understood that the culture of the building would protect them the same way it protected every other. Secret. The screening of black guests, which Jimmy Cahew had described from his years of service, was corroborated by additional sources. The practice of evaluating potential guests by telephone, of directing black diners to interior tables away from the terrace and the pool, of maintaining an unwritten but thoroughly understood hierarchy of visibility based on race, was not the aberration of a single prejudiced manager. It was embedded in the operational culture. It was, in the language the Chateau best understood, a product feature. The silence that protected celebrities also protected discrimination. The walls that concealed affairs also concealed bigotry. The system could not distinguish between the secrets it was asked to keep because the system had been designed specifically not to make distinctions. The general manager issued an apology. The statement acknowledged that the hotel had fallen short of its values, that mistakes had been made, that the organization was committed to meaningful change. The language was careful and corporate, produced with the precision of a crisis communications firm whose primary objective is to stop the bleeding without acknowledging the wound. The apology satisfied no one because it addressed no one specifically. Civil lawsuits followed. Black employees filed discrimination claims in court. The legal process began to convert individual testimony into institutional liability. Each filing added detail. Each deposition added specificity. The Chateau Marmont, which had survived lawsuits before, now faced a fundamentally different kind of legal threat. This was not a dispute over a word in a book. This was a dispute over decades of alleged practice, supported by dozens of witnesses willing to testify under oath. The celebrity boycott gathered force with remarkable speed. Jane Fonda announced she would no longer patronize the hotel. Spike Lee pledged to take his business elsewhere. Alfonso Cuarón joined. Tom Morello of Rage Against the Machine. Ta-Nehisi Coates. The names accumulated, each one a withdrawal from the economy of prestige that had sustained the Chateau for decades. The institutional support was even more devastating. SAG-AFTRA formally advised its members to avoid the property. The Writers Guild of America issued similar guidance. The Teamsters pulled their support. The Directors Guild of America followed. The California Democratic Party relocated its events permanently. Aaron Sorkin had a night shoot scheduled at the property. It was canceled hours before cameras were set to roll. The production trucks rerouted. The Chateau left dark on a night it had expected to be lit. Consider the scale of this collapse. 248 workers laid off without severance, more than 30 sources in a single investigative article. $1,950,000 in PPP funds whose distribution was publicly questioned. $46,000 for Lindsay Lohan's 47-day stay, a bill the hotel reportedly chose not to pursue. 260 names on a ban list applied according to spending power. 5 major entertainment unions withdrawing support simultaneously. One night shoot canceled. 191-year-old mythology of silence, cracking from the inside out. The chateau still stood. The concrete was undamaged, but the product that the building sold, that Balazs had spent 3 decades refining, was silence. And the silence was broken. The question now was whether the building could survive without it. # Chapter 9. The word boycott projected onto the castle. In March of 2022, union organizers projected a single word across the chateau's Gothic facade during Beyoncé's Oscars after party, and that word changed everything. The image was startling and inescapable. The Chateau Marmont at night, its turrets and arched windows lit from below in the warm amber glow that had been photographed 10,000 times and across the entire face of. The building, in white letters large enough to read from Sunset Boulevard, the word boycott. Inside, some of the most famous people in the world were attending one of the most exclusive events of the awards season. Champagne was being poured. Music was playing through speakers that cost more than most of the former workers earned in a month. Outside, those former workers held signs and chanted demands that the guests inside could hear through the reinforced concrete walls that had been absorbing secrets since 1929. For the first time in the building's history, the noise outside was louder than the noise inside. The Unite Here picket outside the Gold Party was not a spontaneous eruption of anger. It was the culmination of 2 years of sustained organizing that had begun the day 248 workers were laid off without severance and had accelerated with every subsequent revelation. The union had been methodical. It had gathered testimony. It had coordinated with allied unions across the entertainment industry. It had filed charges with the National Labor Relations Board, and the NLRB ruling, when it came, confirmed what the workers had argued from the beginning. They had the right to organize, the right to bargain collectively, and the employer had a legal obligation to negotiate in good faith. The ruling was not a suggestion. It was the law. Pastor Stephen Q. Jeanine Marie, a community organizer and clergy member who had been working with the chateau's former employees since the initial layoffs, gave the conflict its most vivid and enduring framing. He called the hotel's labor practices plantation capitalism. The term was deliberately provocative and precisely aimed. It connected the chateau's treatment of its predominantly Latino and Black workforce to a much longer American tradition of extracting labor from people of color while denying them voice, agency, and fair compensation. The word plantation hung in the air above Sunset Boulevard, the way the word boycott hung on the building's facade. Impossible to ignore, impossible to contextualize away, and impossible to absorb into the mythology of discretion that had protected the chateau for nearly a century. The pressure converged from every direction simultaneously. The entertainment unions maintained their boycotts. The celebrities maintained their distance. The lawsuits ground forward through the courts. The NLRB ruling had stripped away the legal foundation for resisting organization. And the proposed conversion to a private members-only club, which had been Balazs' attempt to restructure the business around a model that would not require a unionizable workforce, was becoming untenable. A private club still needed staff. Staff still had the right to organize. And the public relations cost of the conversion, now permanently associated in the press with union avoidance rather than luxury exclusivity, exceeded any operational benefit it might have provided. In August of 2022, the Chateau Marmont and Unite Here issued a joint statement. The hotel would allow unionization to proceed. The private club conversion was abandoned. Workers would return with the right to collective bargaining, formal grievance procedures, and the legal protections that come with union representation. The people who had been fired without severance, who had marched with giant checks, who had spoken to reporters using their real names, who had stood outside a building they had maintained for decades while celebrities celebrated inside, had won. By December of 2022, the first contract was ratified. The Chateau Marmont, which had operated for 93 years on a culture of unwritten rules and whispered expectations, now operated under a written agreement that specified wages, conditions, and the rights of the people who did the actual work of maintaining the building and its mythology. The building survived. It always survives. That is what reinforced concrete does. But the mythology of silence, the product that had been the chateau's greatest source of revenue and its deepest moral liability, was permanently altered. The walls still stood. The turrets still rose. The bungalows still nestled in their gardens. But the guarantee that what happened inside would stay inside was no longer absolute. The workers had done what the building had spent a century preventing. They spoke, and the irony was as thick and durable as the concrete walls themselves. The Chateau Marmont endured because its workers finally broke its oldest rule. The fortress held, the silence did not. Hashtag Chapter 10, the hotel that refused to die. The Chateau Marmont has outlived the Depression, a world war, at least 5 major earthquakes, and the most famous drug overdose in Hollywood history, and it is still taking reservations. The rooms today are priced between $700 and $2,300 per night. The bungalows cost more. Bungalow 3, the one where John Belushi died on a winter morning in 1982, is still available for booking. It is still requested by name. There is no plaque on the door. There is no memorial in the garden. There is no acknowledgement, visible to the eye or printed in any hotel literature, that a man died on the bed inside. There is only the same cottage in the same garden, cleaned and restocked and furnished with the same deliberately worn elegance that characterizes every room in the building. Ready for the next guest, who wants to sleep where the most famous comedian in America stopped breathing. The chateau does not comment on the requests. It simply fulfills them. The transaction requires no words. It never has. André Balazs remains the owner. 3.5 decades of single stewardship, longer than any previous owner since the building opened in 1929. Katie Ford, his former wife, remains connected to the property's financial structure. The relationship between the two, like most relationships that involve the Chateau Marmont, is complex and largely undisclosed. What is public is that the building continues to operate under the ownership of the man who purchased it for $12 million and spent 30 years transforming it into a monument to monetize silence. The workforce is unionized. The first contract, ratified in December of 2022, established formal grievance procedures, wage standards, and workplace protections that the employees had never previously possessed in the building's entire history. The silent machinery of the chateau now operates under written rules rather than whispered norms. Whether this change has fundamentally altered the culture of the building or merely formalized its existing practices under new language and new oversight is a question that only the workers themselves can fully answer. And the answer likely varies from shift to shift, from room to room, from one quiet encounter in a hallway to the next. In December of 2024, the Italian luxury house Brunello Cucinelli hosted an intimate dinner at the chateau. The guest list included Oprah Winfrey, Kevin Costner, Sharon Stone, and John Hamm. The event was photographed. It was reported in the press. It was, in every respect, a return to the chateau's traditional function, a gathering of the famous in a beautiful and storied space, observed by some, concealed from others. existing in that familiar twilight between public and private that the building has occupied since 1929. The chateau endures. It does not endure because its problems were resolved. The allegations of racial discrimination are not erased by a union contract. The memory of 248 terminations without severance does not dissolve because a new agreement is signed. John Belushi is still dead. The building endures because Hollywood's appetite for beautiful places that keep secrets is apparently inexhaustible. The demand for the product has survived every scandal that should have destroyed it. The walls are the same walls. The concrete is the same concrete, and the city below, stretching from the base of the hill to the Pacific Ocean, is still a city that manufactures images and needs a place where those images can be safely. Contradicted. Hashtag Chapter 11. Every owner got the hotel they deserved. 5 owners in nearly a century, and each one turned the chateau into a mirror of exactly who they were. Fred Horowitz was a builder. He wanted permanence in a city built on sand and celluloid and the shaky promise of endless sunshine. And he got it. His Chateau Marmont was a fortress of engineering. Classe à concrete. Earthquake-proof. Fire-resistant. A rational answer to an irrational city that grew by instinct rather than plan. He built the strongest building on Sunset Boulevard and lost it within 5 years, not because the building failed, but because the economy underneath it collapsed. The concrete held while the stock market did not. Horowitz got the hotel he deserved, one that was structurally perfect and financially impossible. Albert E. Smith was an opportunist, and that word carries no insult here. He had built Vitagraph Studios from a rooftop operation in Brooklyn into one of the first major film companies in America and sold it for a fortune. He knew how to see value where others saw wreckage. When Horowitz's fortress went bankrupt, Smith bought it for half its construction cost and converted it into something the original owner had never imagined. He filled it with furniture bought from the ruined and opened it to an industry that was, alone among American enterprises, thriving while the rest of the nation starved. Smith got the hotel he deserved, a bargain that became an institution. Erwin Brettauer was a quiet revolutionary. He desegregated the Chateau Marmont at a time when doing so was neither legally required nor commercially rewarded. He opened the doors to Duke Ellington and to a generation of black artists who had been turned away from every comparable establishment in the city. He did not announce this policy. He did not call the newspapers. He did not position himself as a civil rights pioneer seeking praise or publicity. He simply enacted his conviction and let the building do the rest. Brettauer got the hotel he deserved, one that did the right thing without ever asking for credit. The owners of the 1960s and 70s, a rotating series of investors and management companies whose names have largely faded from the public record, treated the chateau as a holding rather than a calling. They maintained it minimally. They invested little in upgrades or renovation. They allowed the building to age in the specific way that old money ages, gracefully, slowly, accumulating character rather than decay, developing the patina that cannot be. Manufactured and can only be earned by the patient passage of time. Under their stewardship, the chateau became the shabby, elegant icon that a generation of rock musicians and young actors and writers on Deadline would discover and claim as their own. These owners got the hotel they deserved, a property that appreciated in mythology even as it depreciated on the balance sheet. Raymond Sarlo arrived in the 1970s and fell in love. He had gone through a divorce and moved into the chateau, and somewhere between the first night and the 100th, the building became his home, his project, his identity, and his reason for getting up in the morning. He knew every guest by name. He walked the halls at night. He maintained the culture of discretion, not as a business strategy or a revenue optimization technique, but as a personal ethic, the ethic of a host who believed that privacy was something you owed to the people who trusted you with their presence. Under Charlotte, the chateau was not a corporation. It was a household, and he was its devoted and slightly eccentric host. He got the hotel he deserved, one that loved him back. And then André Balazs. He looked at a building that had been keeping secrets by instinct for 6 decades and saw a product that could be systematized, branded, and sold at $950 a night. He raised the hedges. He trained the staff. He transformed organic discretion into a luxury brand with a waiting list and a mythology. Balazs got the hotel he deserved, an extraordinarily profitable machine that eventually broke because the people who operated it were never treated as anything more than replaceable parts. 5 owners, 5 versions of the same building. The chateau accepted every one of them and outlasted every one of them. It stands today as it has always stood, indifferent to the ambitions and failures of the people who believe they own it. You do not own the Chateau Marmont. You hold it for a while. Then you pass it on, and the walls remain. Chapter 12. The walls remember everything. Fred Horowitz built a building that could not be broken by the earth, and he never imagined that the real damage would come from the people inside it. This is the paradox the Chateau Marmont has been living for nearly 100 years. Containment. The paradox of walls. Walls built to protect become walls that conceal. A structure designed to keep danger out becomes the structure that keeps danger in. The same reinforced concrete that absorbs the force of an earthquake also absorbs the sound of a party that lasts 3 days and ends with broken glass and white powder and a bill that nobody ever collects. The same hillside location that shields the building from the noise of Sunset Boulevard also shields Sunset Boulevard from the noise of the building. The protection goes both ways. It always has. When silence is the product, silence cannot be selective. This is the lesson the chateau learned, or rather, the lesson the chateau's workers forced it to learn, at great personal cost, over the course of decades. You cannot train a housekeeper to ignore cocaine on a nightstand and then expect her to report misconduct in a stairwell. You cannot train a front desk clerk to deny a guest's presence to a reporter and then expect him to confirm a manager's abuse to a labor board. You cannot build a culture of silence and then draw a line through the middle of it, silence on one side, speech on the other, and expect human beings to know which side of the line they are standing on at any given moment. The system is total or it is nothing. And when the system is total, it protects everyone inside it, including the people who do not deserve protection, and it exposes everyone who maintains it, including the people who deserve to be safe. The Chateau d'Amboise, the building Fred Horowitz fell in love with in the Loire Valley in 1925, was a royal fortress. It was a place of extraordinary beauty perched above a river in the heart of France. It was also a place of execution. Conspirators against the crown were hanged from its balconies. Their bodies were left to swing above the water, turning slowly in the wind, as a warning to anyone who might consider challenging power from within the walls that housed it. The castle survived for 5 centuries because it served power. It housed kings and punished those who threatened them. Its beauty was inseparable from its violence. The Chateau Marmont, Horowitz's American copy, became a fortress of a different kind. No one was hanged from its balconies, but reputations were destroyed inside its walls. Careers ended in its bungalows. A life ended in Bungalow 3, and the building absorbed the death and converted it, with the cold efficiency of a machine that cannot feel, because machines do not feel, into a selling point. The beauty of the Chateau Marmont has always been inseparable from its cost. The cost was simply hidden, muffled by the same thick walls that had been the building's first and most enduring feature. Howard Hughes stood on his penthouse balcony with binoculars, watching the pool, a figure of immense wealth and deepening madness framed against the California sky. Montgomery Clift, after the car accident that shattered his face and the reconstructive surgery that rebuilt it into something he could barely recognize, stood on his balcony. Screaming into the night, naked and beyond reach, his voice absorbed by the concrete walls before it could travel far enough to disturb anyone on the boulevard below. Greta Garbo disappeared into her suite and did not emerge for days, existing in the silence she had always demanded, finally in a building that could provide it completely. John Belushi disappeared into Bungalow 3 and did not emerge at all. Each story is different. Each story ends the same way. The building absorbs it. The walls hold. The next guest arrives. The building stands today exactly where it has always stood. 7 stories of reinforced concrete on a hillside above Sunset Boulevard. Gothic turrets modeled after a French castle where conspirators were killed. A garden where bungalows sit among hedges so dense that the structures are nearly invisible from any angle. A pool surrounded by foliage that has been growing thicker for decades. A lobby so small that most guests never pass through it. A staff that is now unionized, now protected by contract, now possessed of the legal right to speak about what they see and what they experience. A mythology that is dented but not destroyed. A reservation system that is still accepting bookings at rates that would have astonished every owner except the current one. Fred Horowitz wanted to build something that could not be broken. He succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. The building cannot be broken. Not by earthquakes. Not by financial collapse. Not by war, scandal, boycott, or the accumulated weight of nearly a century of secrets pressed into its walls like fossils into stone. The question was never whether the Chateau Marmont would endure. It will. The concrete will hold. The turrets will stand. The reservations will continue. The bungalows will be cleaned and restocked and offered to the next guest who needs a place where the world cannot see them. The question is what it means that Hollywood's most enduring institution is a building designed to keep the outside world from hearing what happens inside, and whether the workers who finally broke that silence changed the building forever, or whether the walls have simply absorbed their voices too, holding them alongside everything else, filed away in the quiet dark, alongside the music and the laughter and the screaming and the sirens, waiting, as the building has always waited, for whatever comes next.